Beautiful. Thank you so much. I learned that melody as a song, going home, going home, I'm going home. Yeah. So nice. I love these cold, sunny days, especially when there's a few flowers that survived the frost. They remind us of all kinds of things. We get to feel both the warmth of the sun and the chill of the air. We get to see the plants struggling and the plants surviving, and we get to feel the life moving in and through all that is. It's just a wonderful, wonderful experience. Is this mic in a good spot for you guys? Mm-hmm. All right. And when we get to be in the experience of the moment, some marvelous things happen. And periodically I'm reminded that we are human beings, not human doings. Even though you'd never know it to look at most of our schedules. What does it mean to be? Yeah, what does it mean to be? And what does it mean to be something that I've imagined might possibly could happen sometime, somewhere? I mean, really, how can I be that? We're so accustomed to fixing things and making things and doing things and taking the next step. Just to sit and be that. My goodness. Now I know most of you are at an age where you actually have time to try it. It's kind of cool, isn't it? To just get up in the morning and be. Get up in the morning and see what's really happening and listen to what's really going on around us. Instead of get up in the morning and get dressed, get ready, and get out the door, and blah, 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 blah. You know, well, some of us did that this morning, didn't we? Yeah. Especially if our clocks weren't quite right. We may be seeing more people coming in the door in the next few minutes. Yeah. So, about 100 years ago, a young man was living in England training to be a barrister. And he'd grown up in India. His family were well-to-do civil servants under the British Empire, and they sent him off to school. And to be a barrister is a form of lawyer that gets up in the courts and speaks either for or against a case. And so he was quite erudite. He could speak beautifully. He wrote incredibly well. And he was very proud. He and his wife, who he'd married at the age of 13, had born some very beautiful children that he was raising as proper English gentlemen with their woolen suits and all those good things. Well, one day he was called to go to help some Indians out in South Africa, at the part of South Africa that was still part of the British Empire. And so he got, on a steamship, and then he got on a train, and he was a well-to-do young man, and so he paid for a first-class ticket, and he got to a particular town in South Africa. The conductor saw this young, dark-skinned person on the train in the first-class cabin, and even though he held the ticket, he refused to go to third class, which was where dark-skinned people were expected to be, and so was thrown off the train. And that was the beginning of a major change in the life of Mahatma Gandhi. He went on, found his way down to the community that had hired him. Some very wealthy Indian merchants in South Africa were coming up against some issues, and so they hired him as their barrister in the British courts and wanted to have him deal with their issues. And he saw for the first time what he had never experienced before, and that was white supremacy rearing its ugly head. And it was almost intolerable for him. He still thought of himself as a Brit. He still thought himself as raising perfect English gentlemen. He brought his family down there, and he still had them dressed in their woolen clothing, even in South Africa. Okay. And, yet his confidence was getting eroded in that. He had been taught that he was a British citizen with all the rights of a British citizen, and yet he was not being allowed to experience that. And he saw more and more people around him not being allowed to experience that. And so he began to realize that he needed to live his life being a different kind of person. And he ended up setting up an ashram in South Africa, saying we need to be who we truly are, not pretend to be what we're not allowed to be. It's a very different approach. And it was very hard on his family to shift from being upper middle class British citizens to being Indians in an ashram. They weren't ready for that. And in fact, if you happen to see the movie Gandhi, you saw the battle between him and his wife when he says we all have to take turns cleaning the latrines, and she's going, no, that's the work of the untouchables, that's not my work, I'm Brahman. No, it is everybody's work. It was very hard to break through the caste system as well as the citizenship issue of being part of the British Empire, but not allowed to be fully. That opened a door, and as time went on, Gandhi chose to be more and more like the working men of India, and less like the upper class British citizen that he had thought he was. And he began to dress like a working man in a doji, which is basically a strip of cloth wrapped around one's middle. It's one of the things I learned how to do growing up because my grandmother, when she was in India, got to work on some of Gandhi's projects. So I got to learn how to wear a sari and got to learn how a dhoti was tied and all those good things. When he finally boarded a steamship to go back to India with his family and some of the followers of his ashram, he spent a year traveling around India to just see what was really going on there, because he hadn't been there since he was a child, really. And what he saw was the depths of the poverty and the heights of the riches. Because what was happening under the British Empire is what is beginning to happen here, where 1% control 99% of the wealth. And he saw that some of that poverty was a poverty of knowledge and spirit, more than a poverty of money or resources. That as people began to think of themselves as not having enough, they couldn't see the ways in which they did have enough. And as people began to think of themselves as isolated individuals, they began to forget how to share the wealth that they had in ways that would increase the life of everyone there. So one of the things that my grandmother was asked to do was to help the young mothers learn how to pool their resources to care for the children and to give the young mothers some time to take care of themselves, which had been lost in the way that the Indian family and the Indian society had broken down under the empire. Another thing that she was asked to do was to help them learn how to take the cotton that they were raising, to take some of it and spin it and weave it, so they could have a second sari to wear. Many of the women that she knew had one outfit, one sari, 6 yards of cloth wrapped around in a specific way. So she was involved in helping them learn to weave and create their clothing. And then they could actually wash their own saris because they could wear something else. and they could have clean saris. Little tiny things. And what Gandhi himself did, wearing a working man's clothing, was organize his life so that he was sharing his food, sharing the milk from the goats, spinning the goat hair and the cotton into clothing. And it was often difficult, again, you can see this in the movie, Gandhi, it was often difficult for the politicals who remained in the upper class, who remained, generating wealth and driving around in cars and coming to meet him in his ashram. They would find it hard to wait until he finished his spinning to have a meeting about what they were going to do next in the revolution. But he made his commitment. He had found a pattern of life which is actually very similar to St. Benedict's rule. You spend a certain amount of time every day in the silence, a certain amount of time every day doing basic working tasks, a certain amount of time every day working for the larger community. And so everyone else had to wait until it was that time of day when Gandhi was free to work for the larger community. Interesting that a Hindu ashram would operate under St. Benedict's rule, the Catholic monasteries operating principles. But it worked. He produced about 3,000 words a week in print, and was able to provide, by being the world in which he wished to be living in, the guidance and support that motivated millions of people to non-violently overturn an empire. They did a pretty good job. And sometimes it fell apart. And then he would do other things to be a model of what could be, how we could be living. He developed a term, satyagraha, which meant being the peace you wish to see in the world. And we continue to benefit from the results of that, even though the basic issues he was fighting against continue to be emerging in our world, but less and less each time. I know it seems when we're looking at an issue out there, we're seeing people getting killed because they're the wrong color, or stopped on the highway because they're being profiled. But that is so much less than what was going on 100, 200, 500 years ago. We can almost be thankful. But we know it needs to be not happening at any level anymore. So how can we be what we need to be to know that no one thinks they are better than any other human being? We have a principle here in the Unitarian movement. We call it the inherent worth and dignity of every human being. And we actually, for one of the groups I'm working with here in town, have shortened that a little bit. We have little tiny buttons in the back, and we've expanded it. Our little tiny buttons say, the little ones say, inherent worth and dignity of every being. We just leave out human. Every being. Now in the Buddhist tradition, every being is a sentient being. And there is an inherent worth and dignity there. Gandhi wasn't a Buddhist, but he recognized that. And he wanted us to recognize that it was true, especially when we encounter other two-legged beings that we call humans. Part of what leads to the issues of racial supremacy and caste levels, only the untouchables can handle the latrines. Part of what does that is the sense that you look a little different from me, so you must be other. And if you are other, you are not one of us. And if you are not one of us, you don't get to do what we get to do. Now, in our culture, that comes to its peak in middle school, yes? And if it is retained beyond middle school, I worry. Right? So in some ways what's happened in the United States is that many, many, many people have gotten locked into middle school attitudes. How can we be something a little more mature than 13? As we look around the world, you know, my view of the world starts about 4000 BC and ends about 3080, or BCE, and CE if you use the new nomenclature. And some reason my vision and my ears take in what's only happening in this little 50, 80 year, 100-year span, but my awareness is this whole thing, right? And it's kind of cool. Because what it does is it allows me to see these shifts and changes and unfoldings that are happening all the time, and where we are in that process. And if I think about that, what I can see is isolated groups of, the people, the name of everyone we call a tribe or a nation, they think is their name for the word people, okay? So if I'm Navajo, I say Dene, I mean the people, right? And anyone that isn't Dene isn't people. And that's what was normal for many, many thousand years. And then over a period of time, a few people who took that in a very extreme way, who primarily were Caucasians, imposed that on everyone else. And, well, that's beginning to finally wear out. And I am pleased to say we are almost at the end of that process. Thank you. However, we still have that fundamental thing called the other. Can we begin to get over that? What would it take to realize that even those who are imposing their sense of supremacy on others are not other than I? That even those who have never ever experienced the kinds of benefits that I have experienced in the form of education and experience, opportunities to be in other countries and experience other cultures and see and know and taste other ways of being, that they are not other than me. There are no others. We are all the people. All. How can I be that? Can I imagine a world in which everyone knows that everyone is people? Everyone has inherent worth and dignity. Can I imagine a world in which not only every human being is, but that every being is, every butterfly, every slug, every fish, every bird, every tree, every weed has inherent worth and dignity. That we are all interconnected whole. Can I imagine a world in which everyone knows that and feels that? And if I can imagine it, can I imagine being that? One of my favorite songwriters, a guy named Daniel Nahmad, actually Nahmad, but we're in America, Nahmad, has written a song, in which he says, do I want peace in the world? Well, am I peaceful? I want love in the world. Am I loving? I want the world that is like that. Am I that? Wow. And one of the things I love about this congregation is most of you are aware of most of what I just said. This is not new stuff to you, except possibly the idea that there are no others. There is no one out there who is other than us. No religious tradition, no political conviction, no way of living on the planet that is other than. Can I live, can I be fully aware that we are all aspects of ourselves, oneself? Can I know that the person who is out there shooting a gun just for the fun of it, and I heard that yesterday, wow, that's part of me too. Can I know that that dandelion that insists on coming up in that one crack in my sidewalk is part of me? Yeah. Can I know that those slugs who want to devour my favorite flower plants or who are eating my kale are part of me too? Can I be? What does it take for me to be that connected being? One of my favorite people in the world taught me how to be present with those other than, those other beings that I have felt were others, like slugs, and like, the rodents in our world, that sometimes occupy spaces we would rather they didn't. How can I invite the rodents not to occupy those spaces without treading on their inherent worth and dignity? And it's possible, and that's so cool. Even ants. If we come into relationship with them as inherently worthy, and recognize that we are sharing a space, and that we can define boundaries within that space, and I will happily make sure you have plenty over there if you don't mind not coming here. It works. But we have to be from that place of we are equally worthy of being in this planet, in this forest, in this community. I will happily encourage people to explore the stages of development that allow them to discover that there is no other. Which is a little different from saying, I'm going to impose my assumptions and expectations on them. One of the most important tools for me in all of this process has been the use of the imagination. And so I would invite you, if you're coming up against an edge in anything I'm saying, I'd invite you to be in your imagination that which you haven't yet seen yourself able to be in the physical. It's one of the 3 ways that we can be that which we wish to see more of in the world. Imagine it. Be in that space. Imagine what it would taste like, feel like. Imagine what the emotions would be like to hang out with someone that you've never hung out with before. One of the points that I was hearing in a radio interview the other day was that while many of us have had children, when we were growing up, we had friends at school of other races, of other traditions, how many of us went home with them and discovered what it was like to be in their home environment? Yeah, that was an interesting point. Most kids, it ends at the playground. What would it be like to be in that environment? Fortunately, we have enough videos and books out there now that we can kind of imagine it. Right? I grew up without a father. I had to imagine, and I used books and movies to help me, imagine what it would be like to have a man in my home all day, or every day, for some period of time every day. That was a very big thing. The second way that we can be that which we wish to see in the world is to create safe spaces where we can role play, where we can try it on. What would happen in a safe place if I encountered this, which has felt so other and dangerous because it is other? And then the third way is to go visiting those spaces where it feels like that, whatever that means. Going to other countries, going to other neighborhoods. I lived in Portland for a very long time, and I met a number of people who lived in Southwest Portland who were appalled to think that I lived in Northeast Portland, who never crossed the bridges, ever, for any reason, to go to the east side. Wow. I actually had a professor tell me that as long as I lived in the neighborhood I lived in, I'd never make full professor.
Oh, man.
Wow. Right? Just going across the bridge was a huge thing for those folks. It's okay. I invited them over for tea.
Did they cross the bridge?
A couple of them actually did. If we can begin to try on those areas, and for many of the people in this room, there are very few, but there are some places where we have made something be other than, and we all want a world in which that's not happening. So I invite all of us to be the change we wish to see in the world. Thank you very much.